Historically, whether it's women's rights, civil rights, whatever it is, the most effective thing you can do is get in these streets. So if a march is called or a rally, show up. Show up.
Welcome to Women We Should Know with international speaker, mindset reset mentor, author, and your host, Leslie Michaels. With audacious honesty and candor, the Women We Should Know podcast presents the wisdom and life-empowering insights of women who are the embodiments of innovation and social evolution. Please join Leslie as she shares potent conversations that will inspire your personal and professional evolutions.
Welcome back to Women We Should Know. It is always the high point of my day, as you've heard me say many times, when I get to sit down and speak with an amazing woman who colors outside the lines, only notices the boundaries that seem reasonable, and is out there speaking in a very educated and forward-moving voice on behalf of all women. Because as all of you out there listening, and we here in the studio know, when women are impacted in a positive way, so are children, so are families, societies, and ultimately the world. So it is always my honor to be able to bring these voices to each of you. And today I am thrilled and honored to bring to you a woman who has been on the forefront of the struggle for women's equality and women's equity for quite a few decades. Dr. Martha Burk is a political psychologist and women's issues expert, specializing in gender pay equity, and she is co-founder of the Center for Advancement of Public Policy, which is a research and policy analysis organization in Washington, D.C. She serves as the money editor for Ms. Magazine and is a syndicated newspaper columnist and blogger for womensvoicemedia.org. Her public radio show, Equal Time with Martha Burk, originates from KSFR Public Radio in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And her latest book, Your Voice, Your Vote, The Savvy Women's Guide to Politics, Power, and the Change We Need, is a Ms. Magazine book selection. Dr. Burk's work has been published in major newspapers, and she has appeared on all major television networks in the United States. From 2000 to 2005, Dr. Burk served as chair of the National Council of Women's Organizations, which is a network of over 200 national women's groups, collectively representing 10 million women, 10 million of us. In that capacity, she led the campaign to open Augusta National Golf Club to women, and she remains at the forefront of change for women in corporate America. In addition to extensive work on domestic policy, Dr. Burk has conducted training workshops with women's NGOs internationally in Macedonia and Kuwait under the sponsorship of UNESCO and the United Nations, and has conducted trainings in the US for delegations from Russia, Botswana, Korea, Romania, Bulgaria, and the Middle East. She has recently been a member of the official US delegations to international conferences in Cuba, Iceland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and China. It is a wonderful thing that Dr. Burk enjoys travel as much as she is all over the place. And today she is here with us, and she has wonderful things to share with all of you women who are out there listening. So it is my delight to welcome you, Dr. Burk, to Women We Should Know.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I've been very excited about this particular podcast and this particular conversation. And one of the things that has been running through my mind is my curiosity about the details and the nuance and the progressions of our legislative process through the decades in respect to women. Would you be willing to speak to that for us?
Absolutely.
Good.
Because it's been going on since 1871 and probably before that.
Mm-hmm.
But I would like to just address sort of an overview here of how tough it has been for women. It's getting a little bit easier, but let's start at the start. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to all men in 1871, 3 years after the Civil War. So they granted citizenship and equal protection under the law to all persons who were born or naturalized in the United States, except persons meant men. Mm. And so they gave Black men the vote. It was right after the Civil War, but no women, white or Black. So this happened in 1871. 52 years later, 52 years, women got the vote. Mm-hmm. And in 1920. But I want to just read a short passage from Carrie Chapman Catt, who was one of the campaigners for the vote, to talk about just how hard it is to get legislation passed for women. We're going to fast forward and talk about now, but believe me, now it ain't easy either. But here is what the suffragists had to go through. To get the word male, in effect, out of the US Constitution cost women of the country 52 years of pauseless campaign. They were forced to conduct 56 campaigns to male voters, 48 campaigns to legislators to submit suffrage amendments to the voters, 47 campaigns to get state constitutional conventions to include women's suffrage planks, 30 campaigns to get presidential party conventions to adopt women's suffrage planks and party platforms, and 19 campaigns with 19 successive Congresses. That's 38 years if you're keeping count. That was just for the Congresses, 52 years in all. Mm-hmm. So that's what we had to do just to get the vote. Mm-hmm. And we are still struggling with a number of things that we don't have yet. And the main thing we don't have still, and this may be a surprise to some of our listeners today, it may not, we don't have equal rights in the United States Constitution.
That's right.
Even though we have had the vote since 1920. But the Equal Rights Amendment, because the guys said when we started a campaign in 1960 something to get the Equal Rights Amendment ratified, and it finally passed out of the states for ratification in 1973. Mm-hmm. The guys all said, you don't need it because you have equal protection under the Constitution, 14th Amendment. Well, we've just seen that we don't. Right. Women were exempted. So we did get the Equal Rights Amendment out to the states, and it took 38 states to ratify the amendment and for it to become part of the United States Constitution. It was 52 years already after the right to vote, and we still don't have it. We're now from 1972 when they started to ratify in the states. We finally got the last state to ratify year before, 2020. Virginia was finally the last state to ratify. So the feminists and other women who may not count themselves as feminists, but they believe we should be equal, said, okay, great, we're now in the Constitution. And the boys on Capitol Hill said, wait a minute, there was a time limit on the ERA, even though that's nowhere in the constitutional rules that call for ratification, they put a time limit on. So they said, in the time limit's passed, you're dead in the water. Well, right now it's hanging in limbo. Some people think that the I think it's the National Parliamentarian that publishes it, and it would become law. And that's all we need to do, because that time limit was not part of the process, shouldn't have been ever. But the women on the Hill, on Capitol Hill right now, have got a joint resolution, and I will have to say a lot of men have joined into this, and it passed the House just a year ago, about a year ago. It was introduced, and they're trying to say, we want to just pass a little bill that says that time limit goes away, and then we'll be in the Constitution, but not until. So ladies, if you think you're equal, think again. We still have work to do, and go back to the way those suffragists had to work for darn near a century to even get the right to vote, which brings me to another thing. It brings me to another thing, and we need to be aware of this. Women can control any election. Any election. Remember that, girls. You can control it. Why? Because you're the majority of the population.
Yes.
You're the majority of those that are registered to vote, and you are the majority of those that actually show up at the polls and vote. So what does that mean? If we vote together and vote for things that will advance women, we can control it. We need more women in the United States Congress, because clearly they vote differently than men on a lot of things, because our priorities are different. So that's a little introduction to how legislation works, and it's a bit discouraging, but anyway, it's a struggle. It's a struggle.
It is a struggle, and we are not only not equal at this point, we're on the precipice of losing some of our intrinsic rights to our own biology.
We certainly are, and all you have to do is move to the state of Texas, and you've lost a fundamental right now.
That's right. Yes.
Because they have, as probably many of our guests know, Texas has all but abolished the right to reproductive freedom and choice and to have an abortion. They're even going after birth control pills. They think that is somehow something that ought to not be available to women. And it's a matter of control.
Yes.
And for those that maybe have not read so much about it, I'll just briefly talk about what that bill does. It empowers the Texas law as it stands now, and it is being challenged, sort of, but it's real hard to challenge. Here's why. They gave the right to enforce it to any citizen. Right. They don't have to even live in Texas. They can bring a lawsuit against a clinic, a woman that seeks abortion or birth control pills in some cases, the morning after pill. And if they're successful in court, they get a $10,000 bounty. They have really legitimized bounty hunting in Texas.
Basically.
In the 19th century. And
exactly.
And there are 22 or 3 states. It changes, the count changes almost every day. That if this Texas law is upheld and or Roe v. Wade is overturned with a separate case that is working its way to the Supreme Court, it should be decided probably late this summer. It's a Mississippi case that outlaws abortion after 15 weeks. There are over 20 states have copycat laws waiting in the wings. Yes. And I don't know where our guests live, but it could very well be in your state. Yes. So it's a good thing to pay attention to. And again, that makes a difference in who's elected, who's going to vote for this stuff and who is not. And you have to ask questions and know your candidates, and most importantly, show up.
Absolutely. I know the all 3 of the candidates running for Attorney General in Wisconsin want to illegalize birth control even for married women. Oh yeah,
I mean, it's a matter of, being married doesn't help you in this case. It's your gender they're after.
That's right. That is where we are being attacked for our very biology. Yes.
We are being attacked for our biology. And so I would say that's one of the biggest threats to women right now, maybe in the history of this country, in terms of our fundamental rights.
Right.
And because if this bill passes, okay, let's move a little bit ahead. Let's say, okay, they control abortion. How long is it going to be before certain religious institutions are influential enough to say, well, let's just outlaw divorce?
Yes.
Or let's change the child custody laws, which used to be the case that the men owned the kids.
Yes.
And if you left or you got a divorce, too bad, you lost your kids. That could happen again.
Yes.
And don't be fooled to think it can't, because there are sectors of the population and sects, if I could, S-E-C-T-S,
There are.
that believe women are fundamentally inferior and should be under the thumb either of their husband, a guardian, in some cases their sons, even if their son's only 6 years old, and governments in general. So it's a threat.
It is a very real threat that could bring itself to fruition during our lifetime.
Absolutely. And we used to say about passage of the Equal Rights Amendment in my lifetime.
Right.
And now in my lifetime has a completely different meaning. Who would have thunk it that in our lifetime, we've been saying all the time, in our lifetime, the Equal Rights Amendment will pass. Who would have thought that in our lifetime, the fundamental right to control of our own bodies would go away? Because when Roe v. Wade was codified by the Supreme Court, we thought that's the end of that kind of control of women. And now it's right back. Could happen in the next 3 months, by the way.
Yes, it certainly could. Thanks for reminding our listeners of that little piece of data. We could go on and on that same thread. But I would really like to invite you to speak to the entire Feminist Majority Foundation and your involvement there and what it is positioned to accomplish.
Well, I will speak for the Feminist Majority Foundation as well as many other women's groups who are working for women's equality from the city level on up to the National Congress.
Wonderful.
And there are lots of things that the Feminist Majority and other groups are working on that we don't have yet and we need. And but just to roll back a bit, I want to give you an idea how long it takes to get a bill passed in some cases. Because it ain't easy, as I said. Kennedy signed the Equal Pay for Equal Work Act in 1963. John Kennedy signed it, but it had been introduced in 1942. So 21 years later, it passed. And there's another bill, the Paycheck Fairness Act, which goes even further and says, if you're doing this equal work in terms of skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions, even if the job title is different, which that's a pretty frequent trick, they give the women a different title.
Of course.
Then you have to pay equally. That bill came out in 1993. It hadn't passed yet. So it does take a while. But I want to read to you, Ms. Magazine asked me, and I'll just sort of skip over some of this because it's a little bit long, but they asked us to do, some of the authors, to do a wish list of what we wish we had. Right. And I think this one is, it's a little bit informative. So I said, I wish to live in a country like Norway, Spain, Germany, and 13 others who have subsidized childcare. I wish to live in a country like Estonia, Sweden, Croatia, and 38 others who have paid family leave. I wish to live in a country like Liberia, Rwanda, and South Africa, where people who are not white don't have to fear law enforcement. I wish to live in a country like France, Denmark, Italy, and Canada that spend more money on social services than on military hardware.
Mhm.
By the way, the United States owns over 400 warships, just to give you an idea.
Mhm.
I wish to live in a country like Finland, New Zealand, the UK, India, Germany, the Philippines, Norway, Ireland, Iceland, and Bangladesh, where women are often heads of state.
Yes.
And finally, I wish the country I so wish to live in with all of these things would be the United States of America.
That's poignant, Dr. Burk. That is poignant to be able to point that out and list those countries for our listeners.
Well, it is so important, right now, talking about getting legislation passed. We have just had Biden's Build Back Better agenda has pretty much died in the United States Congress. And
Right.
it had funding for pre-kindergarten.
It did.
It had funding for after school. But, those things are priorities for women and not the guys who are still in charge. And we got some good men on our side, don't get me wrong.
Mhm.
But I did an analysis of the budget. That's why I mentioned the warships.
Mm.
People kept saying that the Build Back Better cost too much, but it didn't even compare to the defense budget or the military budget for
Mhm.
1 year. Never
Right.
mind the out years.
Right.
So we have family and medical leave in the
Mm.
United States, 12 weeks of unpaid leave.
Yes.
That bill, and only for large corporations, 50 or more employees. The bill was introduced originally in 1984, and it was vetoed twice by President Bush in 1991 and 92. It finally got signed in 1993. So its journey was, as these things go, relatively short, only 84 to 93. And
Exactly.
that's pretty pathetic, actually.
That is pathetic. And when we talk about equal pay for women, then there are divisions within that. If we look at the figures, equal pay day for white women compared to what men are making doesn't come till the end of February. Equal pay day for Black women doesn't come till June, and Latina women have to wait all the way till October before they hit that equal pay day of what that male earned the year before.
Exactly. And Native women are even further behind that.
Yes, they
I live in
are.
Mexico, and we have a large Native population, and they're really at the bottom of the ladder when it comes to equal pay. Well, just to give you some actual dollars and cents,
Mhm.
below in the hierarchy that you just named, the Hispanic women only make 58.4% of what men make, and white women 79.6. So we've got a long way to go. And there's that Paycheck Fairness Act
Mhm.
that came out in 1990. Here's some things we need that we could get without legislation if the people in control, and you know who they are,
Mhm.
agree to it. If we need public disclosure, especially for large corporations, of what women and men are making. And I'm not talking about your name on a bulletin board or your salary, but
Right.
if your title is vice president for blah, blah, and so is the guy's title, and you've been there as long and so forth, well, they ought to just publish aggregate data. The women in this job category are making X and the men are making Y, and Y is that gap.
Mhm.
And we had that briefly in the state of New Mexico. I was privileged to work with our governor, Bill Richardson, some years back, and we passed a first in the nation disclosure law. And all it said, is this fair or not? Our audience can judge. If you're going to take taxpayer money as a company that contracts with the state government, you have to tell us how you pay women and how you pay men. You have to tell us.
And reasonable.
Yeah, not Jane's making 10,000 and John's making 12, but women in this job category are making X, men are making Y. Here's the wage gap. And so this was a thing that, and I think we need to talk very briefly about how politics plays in, because this was passed and implemented by one governor who was very popular. He was a Democrat. And then the next governor happened to be a Republican, and I am so sorry to say she happened to be female.
Yes, she was.
She completely killed the initiative. It was party politics. And so we have to get over that hump, if you will, and convince people of goodwill in both parties. You know, if you're a family or a legislator for that matter, and you're a Republican, why would you oppose a pay legislation that would equalize? You know, you got a wife, you got kids, you got daughters. They go to college and get the same degree as a guy, and they come out and they're making out of the gate 15% less than the guy, same degree and so forth. And then as the years go on, it widens until it's what it is now. If you're white, 20%, and even worse for women of color. So we need to get some rationality, I guess, to say to these people, okay, I know you don't want X, Y, Z, whatever your priority is that we disagree on. You don't want the vaccine, but do you want your daughter to make the same as your son when she comes out of college, and he does too? And that might be a way to convince a few of them to vote our way, because it does make a difference who gets elected and how they're going to vote once they get there.
Absolutely. But it's also, or this is at least the drama I beat, it's also important for us who do understand what's at risk and do understand the difficulty factors in achieving these levels of simple equality, simple fair treatment, to speak with the men we know who are advocates and get them more engaged in voting, get them more engaged in speaking about it, so that we can counterbalance the women, such as our former governor, who are actually working against women's best interest.
That is absolutely true. You mentioned in the intro that I am affiliated, I'm on the board actually of a group called the World Academy for the Future of Women. And we have a men's cohort in that organization to teach men what women, a lot of men never think about the wage gap. They never think about reproductive freedom because they have it.
Right.
And they're not going to lose it.
No.
And this is a way, it's a separate program, seminar program just for men, to teach men what the issues are and why they should care about them. And it's really quite an eye-opener, because men are not socialized in this country or most countries around the world to pay attention to those sort of issues. It's more like who's going to win the World Series, or, you know, can I carry my gun to Walmart or something like that. But they don't think about, gee, I wish we had after school program. You know, I wish we had paid kindergarten. If we could personalize those things, and I think it may have been during COVID a little more than in the past, because a lot of families, somebody had to quit work. We didn't have any daycare. We didn't have any after school. We didn't even have school for a lot of months. Well, do the math. You got two workers, one's female and one's male. Who has to quit? The lower earner.
That's right. And it's not just the woman or the man. The important point is the lower earner.
Yeah.
That's what speaks volumes.
90%, you know who that is.
That is right.
And, you know, the jobs that were lost too, and I just looked at the Bureau of Labor Statistics numbers that came out yesterday. Jobs that were lost in COVID, and a lot of people we know are quitting and trying to move up. but the women are not gaining the jobs back in the same momentum as men. The men are getting most of the jobs. I don't know if it's because women are still not being hired in the so-called men's jobs, even though they do the work. I don't know. Probably a lot of it is because schools are still in flux and we still don't have childcare. We're not gaining in the employment numbers in the same way that men are yet.
Right. When women are not allowed, by virtue of choice, by virtue of non-employment, whatever their life presents them, to be out and to be socialized and to be engaged in the community conversations, they can lose track of what it is that's being forfeited. They can lose track of what it is we are all fighting for. And so it's important to be able to support these women to engage at multiple levels.
Well, it is. And I just want to say, because I live in a state, and you do too, where we have two senators that are very pro-woman.
Yes.
And they're going to vote in favor of legislation at the national level that benefits women. Like if we ever did get paid family leave,
right,
they're going to vote for it. So you'll be tempted to say, well, I know my senator's on board, or I know my city council person, or, you know, House of Representatives. I don't need to call. You do need to call, because they count it. They want to know that you are behind them. That, you know, you don't want them thinking, well, I could vote for it, but gee, my constituents, I don't hear from them, so maybe it's not important. It is important.
It is important, and that is an essential point.
It is. I do want to tell you some good news.
Oh, please do. Please do, Dr. Burk.
Well, we finally got a bill passed last month. Well, actually, it passed last week, and Biden just signed it, I think, yesterday. We had a bill that actually has been kicking around only for about less than a decade. But it was from Kirsten Gillibrand from New York. And it was to end forced arbitration in sexual assault and harassment cases. And what that means is a lot of companies, when you go to work for them, you sign all this stuff, you know, your social security, health insurance, blah, blah, blah. And buried in there is going to be a clause that says, if you bring a sexual harassment or assault action against somebody in this company, you cannot prosecute or go to law enforcement until you go through arbitration at the company's behest, meaning they get to pick the arbitrator, they get to pick the time, their arbitrator gets to pick the questions that are asked, and it's just grossly unfair to women. Well, she's had this bill since 2017, as I said, less than a decade, which is real interesting, and it just passed. It just passed. So companies can no longer abuse victims of sexual assault and harassment in that way. Now, it applies, of course, to men as well. And we know that some small percentage of men are also sexually harassed, but we also know who that bill is going to benefit.
That's right. That's right. And you bringing this, thank you for bringing that forward. We always want good news. But it brings me back to something you were saying when we spoke a couple of weeks ago about this same issue in the military.
Okay, the military, there's a situation in the military that is horrible for women. Female soldiers, I don't know if they're all called soldiers, some of them are sailors, I guess. I don't know all the military jargon. But if you are a woman in the military and you get raped, it's going to go through to a military tribunal, and it goes up the chain of command. In other words, the superior officer in charge of you and the accused is going to be what amounts to the judge in that trial. And they're going to decide. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to decide to know how they're going to decide. Both
That's right.
people are under their command. One's a guy, you know, it's just very clear. And the same Senator Gillibrand has been trying to get that changed for over a decade, and she has not been successful. They did tweak the law a little bit this year for the Defense Authorization Act. It's part of that. And they said they would have chairman and ranking members to move this forward, but the initial decision is still in the hands of that commanding officer. So, you know, that's the catch-22. And that bill was just signed this past December. So we got to wait another year for another Defense Authorization Act to try to get it to move a little bit further toward the non-partisan, I'll use the word partisan, but non-involved arbitrator in those cases. It needs to be somebody coming from outside.
Yeah, it needs to be an unbiased arbitrator at the very least.
Exactly.
Yes, because both of these situations that you brought forward, what they scream to me is of other ways in which we do not have the right to protect our own biology.
No, we don't.
So thank you for sharing that. I would be so pleased, Dr. Burk, if you would share with me, of course, but with all of our listeners, beyond the basics that we must all do, calling our representatives and voting, even in the small elections, what are 2 or 3 of the most important things that the average woman who isn't out there every day, like you and I are, you are more than I, but both of us are out there every day, the ones who have traditional jobs, traditional families, but they care. What are the things that they can do to contribute to furthering women's cause for themselves, but also for their daughters?
Well, there are a few things, and I realize that all women can't do this. Some women have 2 or 3 jobs.
Right.
They don't have a partner in the home to help. So it's hard to do some of this stuff. But historically, and a lot of people are going to say, oh no, I could never do that. Believe me, you can. Historically, whether it's women's rights, civil rights, whatever it is, the most effective thing you can do is get in these streets. So if a march is called or a rally, show up, have your little sign. Right now, I went out and made a banner a few days ago in solidarity with Ukraine, and I just wrapped it around my tree out front. That is a way to show up. If you can't physically go there or do something, if you don't want to go to a march or can't because you don't have child care and you don't want to push a stroller in a crowd, you can still put a little sign in your window or even a little thing on your workplace. It says, you know, I'm in favor of kindergarten for all, something like that. You can start with something that ought not be that controversial. But you can do that and make those calls and talk to other women and men and say, by the way, did you know that if so, and you know, you can go down to the city council level because city councils have the ability to help fund some things like childcare. It's not a whole lot, but they do have. And so maybe that's the area you want to work in. Tell your neighbor, oh, there's a council meeting. And see, this is another way to show up. You don't have to even be in the streets. You can go sit in that council meeting. And when they bring up this bill, just, you know, raise your hands or let people know that's why you're here. So those are some of the things you can do. Of course, writing letters, as we've talked about, making calls is really pretty easy and simple and free.
It is.
And call some of those that are, you know, are not on your side. That's as important as the ones that are, or maybe more so, because if they get more calls from people they didn't think would vote for them if they don't get on board, that can help. So
great. Well, thank you for those tips. I'm sure our listeners will be writing them down. And by the way, all of you out there listening, I'm going to do for you what I always do for you. You know, I love doing this for you. I'm going to put all of the contact information that Dr. Burk wants to provide, all of the reference information that Dr. Burk wants to provide, and her social media outlets so that you can go to the program notes and be able to access those. So we'll have those all out there floating around for you, Dr. Burk. Who knows who'll be getting in touch with you and asking you for advice or cheering you on. As we get ready to wrap up here today, what is the thing you would like to say to our listeners in closing?
well, I'd like to say, stay aware, stay hopeful. You know, we cannot say, oh my God, we didn't get this last year, so we might as well give up. You can't give up.
Can't give up.
You gotta show up and not give up. Those are the main things. I don't know if this will work because I've never tried it with my camera. My book is
No, it doesn't work.
it's on Amazon. It's got all of these issues in it. It's called Your Voice, Your Vote. And just go look and you'll find something in there that so-called floats your boat. You know,
That's
maybe
right.
you're my age and you don't need kindergarten, but you do need equal Social Security benefits. Or,
That's right.
you know, there's going to be something in there for everybody. And just pick an issue if you can only do one and stay with it. And I want to say one more thing about a local issue, because here in the city where I live in, we have a big problem with guns on the street. And you can start right there at your city level, even your county level, and they're all trying to do something about that one way or the other. I will have to mention, just as a last thing, the Violence Against Women Act had in it this year for the first time, and it first passed in 1994, so it's an old bill. I mean, it's an old law, I should say. But it's always had that you can't have a gun if you're a felon or you've been convicted of sexual harassment or abuse. If you're married to the person, if you're a husband. But it never had what was called the boyfriend loophole. So if you live with somebody or your significant other you weren't married to beat you up, too bad. Well, they had a thing in there that if that had ever happened, the guy could still get a gun. Too bad it got dumped last week out of the bill. So we're still stuck with the boyfriend. It's called the boyfriend loophole.
Boyfriend
And,
loophole.
Yep. So anyway, we still got work to do.
We still have work to do. And so much of it points back to our biology in terms of protecting it.
Yes.
It all points back to our biology in terms of being women, and that is why we have not been given these rights. But so much of it points directly to being able to claim, own, and protect our own biology.
Well, yeah, and I just have to, just in closing, the one more thing you can do, because we're socialized to think about others, to worry about others before we worry about ourselves, vote your own interests.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It doesn't matter who what party your grandmother was or who your mother's voting for. Vote your own interest. Thank you for saying that. Thank you so much for spending this time with us, Dr. Burk. I am confident that our listeners learned a very great deal from you today.
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity. It's been a great pleasure.
Absolutely. And for all of you out there listening, don't worry that you couldn't see the book. And of course, I know some of you are jogging, so you certainly wouldn't be able to see the book. We will put the link in the program notes, because I always do that. I really enjoy being able to help all of you stay in contact with what our guests are doing and to be able to follow them on beyond this podcast. I am absolutely confident that you received great nuggets that you will be able to put in your pocket and carry forward. I've no doubt that some of you had eye-opening moments where you just couldn't imagine that that was still true. And that is wonderful because it gives us an outline for where to start, what needs to be done. And we get to take that inside of ourselves and make a conscious decision of where we want to participate, where we want to contribute, and what we want to advocate for. So I encourage you to do all of these things. And as you go forward through your day, I'd just like to remind you, you truly are stronger and wiser than you know.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. We hope you received inspiration for expanding your own social innovation and influence. Help us inspire others by sharing this episode and leaving your comments over at lesliemichaels.com/podcast. For more tips, insights, and support in creating a fully audacious, professional, and personal lifestyle you love, visit our Women We Should Know community on Facebook.